sort of start the meeting shortly and would appreciate if you can kind of keep an eye on letting people come in because let's see, it looks like another person wanted to come into the meeting. So we can get started in a couple of minutes, giving people a little bit more time. And I'm so pleased that Laura Dewey was available, and not only available, but she's put a lot of thought into how do we challenge the bloated Pentagon budget. And it all fits right in with when we're talking about Donald Trump's effort to try to control our country in ways that are very hurtful to a lot of people. So thank you all for being on this call. And maybe since we're started to record it, I'll do an introduction for those who may not know Laura, and many of you do. Laura is a longtime justice advocate. She's been active with the local peace and justice movements. She joined the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom in the 1990s. So that goes back a ways, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. And she served on its national board. And she's going to be offering us some insights and a call to action on this important topic of challenging the bloated Pentagon budget. And it's like right at a time when there's so many other things that are being attacked, things like access to healthcare. I mean, Gray Panthers have felt healthcare was so basic to people's survival, but also cuts in food stamps. So it's just, and at the same time, they're willing to give massive increases in the Pentagon budget. And maybe we'll hear a little bit more about that here in their presentation. So without anything here, I hear a familiar voice there coming on too. So, hey, Paul.
Yes, and at the same time, the massive tax cuts for the wealthy. That's the insane thing. They're trying to pretend that they're cutting benefits to make room for the tax cuts for the wealthy, which, of course, even though the cuts are draconian, they're not near enough to pay for the super duper tax cuts for the wealthy.
Well, we're going to hear more about this and from Laura. So no doubt, Paul, you and I and other people in this call could probably also give this kind of lecture too. But so without further ado, Laura, you're on board. So we're all ears. Thank you for doing this.
Okay. All right, thank you. I want to thank Randy Block and the Gray Panthers for inviting me. I got to be honest, I had to do a lot of research on this. I don't have numbers off the top of my head like some people do. So this is a great opportunity for me to learn more. I also want to thank two people for pointing me to some resources, Chuck Altman and my sister, Kelly Smith. And I want to give a shout out to my three sibs online right now. Kelly, April, Wendy. Wendy's from Seattle, but she's actually in Detroit now. So thank you for supporting me. I'm hoping to give you some information and resources so that you can educate others about Pentagon spending. And I'm going to talk for about 30 minutes, and I hope we have plenty of time for a question and answer and just conversation. So here's an overview of what I'll be talking about. The topic is so huge, and actually I had to cut back this talk, so I'll only be scratching the surface, but I'll just give a little brief overview of the spending, talk about spending in states, the cost to our society, what is driving our increases in military spending, what's actually in that big, beautiful bill that relates to the Pentagon, and what we can do to slow Pentagon spending, and then we'll talk. So first, an overview. I'm going to show you what I'm sure everybody in this Zoom room knows. U.S. spending it spends more money on so-called defense spending than the next country combined. And you can see that China is second. They probably spend about 300 billion compared to our 960 billion. And as you can see, that we outdwarf them by everybody by huge amounts. And then this is a chart showing the discretionary spending. and it shows that our military budget currently is, or this is actually a couple of years ago, is just about almost 50% of our discretionary spending. Let me explain discretionary spending for a second. It's just that funding that Congress approves every year in programs. So this does not include the entire budget, which would include Social Security and Medicare, because those are the programs we pay into. Those are so-called earned benefit programs. So this is the percentage of discretionary spending. And as you can see, it's a pretty sad picture. And we'll go into more details later. The next slide shows GDP. So how much do we spend compared to our GDP? And this has been an issue recently because our president has been insisting that our allies in Europe and Canada, that they spend 5% of their GDP on military spending. I think he originally said 3% and upped the ante recently, said 5%. And our expenditures right now are roughly 3.5% of the GDP. You can see it rose a lot in the 80s. You can see when Reagan was president, it rose a lot in the early 80s, and then it started to decline, went up and down, and now it's around 3.5%. So if we were to up our spending to 5%, one conservative analysis says that we would have to spend an additional $350 billion to reach that goal. We should not be doing that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this breadth of spending in states. You may know that there are military contractors in every state, including Michigan. So that means Department of Defense money is being spent in every single state. This makes military spending popular with Congress people because they're always trying to bring the bacon home to their state. Now, I like to compare this to the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, in the Depression. I don't know if you all saw it, but several years ago, there's an excellent documentary on PBS about the CCC, and they showed how Roosevelt was such a wily and shrewd politician that he made sure those CCC work camps were spread around the country, especially in conservative and Republican districts, because he wanted to popularize the New Deal. I would argue that military spending works the same way, so that we all get buy-in. And of course, Michigan is no exception. So in this slide, we see Governor Whitmer greeting the president at Selfridge Air Base. It was really disheartening to see her thanking him, much less hugging him, for stationing the 21 F-15EX fighter jets at the Selfridge, because this will actually help ensure the base's future. A few facts about Michigan's spending, defense spending in Michigan. In 2022 to 23 fiscal year, the military contractors in Michigan got $5.5 billion. Of these, General Dynamics got the lion's share, which was $3.9 billion. And most of those federal contract dollars, 65%, come to one county, and I'm sure you can all name it, Macomb County. Now, according to the Michigan Economic Development Corporation, there are 4,000 defense-related businesses and suppliers in Michigan, and they provide 166,000 jobs, nearly 31 billion in economic impact. Now, later, I'm going to talk about how we can bring in more jobs if we had economic conversion. So let's talk about the cost to society. What does military spending do to us? Well, the first thing that it does is, on a real practical matter, it makes us pay more taxes. So in 2024, the average taxpayer paid $3,707 for weapons in war. Compare this to the $149 that you paid for the National Institutes of Health, or the $1.69 you paid for the Corporation of Public Broadcasting, which is now on the chopping block. But another cost is actually more moral. It's talking about underfunding our schools, poor transportation, lack of public housing, lack of not enough programs to meet our human needs. And President Eisenhower addressed this issue as early as 1953. I'm going to read just a little bit of this quote, and which is very salient for today. And he started by saying, every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket ship fired signals in the final sense a theft from those who are hungry and are not fed. Those who are clothed. I'm sorry, I can't read the whole thing because it's blocked by part of the Zoom call. Anyway, you can read the quote up there. It is spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, the hopes of its children. And the cost, and then he goes into talking about the cost of a modern brick, of a modern bomber, that it would mean a modern brick school in more than 30 cities. So he goes on, enumerates a few things that could be paid for if we do not pay for military. This is not a way of life at all in any sense. Is there no other way the world may live? So another way that we pay is actually the militarization of our society. I'm sorry, I actually reversed slides here. No, I'm sorry, I got this right. So another way we pay is about environment. Our military, according to the Veterans for Peace, is the largest polluter in the world. The Department of Defense is the largest institutional oil user of oil and one of the largest emitters of greenhouse gases. And we have Agent Orange still in the bodies of soldiers and people in Vietnam. We still had depleted uranium in Iraq and other countries, and these are effects that'll last for generations. This map shows that there are 770 contamination sites belonging to the DoD. Some are former, some are active, and they have toxins on them, including PFAS, the so-called forever chemicals. And you could see from the dots that there are about 8 sites that are in Michigan, including 2 in the UP, and it looks like 4 in the Detroit or Southeast Michigan area. Another cost of the military, of the rising costs of the military is, frankly, it's a militarization of our society. And we truly have a culture of violence. Gun violence is so pervasive that it's been normalized, and our police have been militarized. They are being trained by Israeli government, the Israeli armed forces. The National Guard is being used to suppress protests in Los Angeles and soon the Marines too. The police state is growing. And some people, like Martin Luther King, see this as a moral issue. During the Vietnam War, he said, "A nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death." Now, the last cost that I'll talk about, and there are many more costs, is the corruption of democracy. Simply put, when corporations have their way, we the people don't have a say. Military contractors literally bribe politicians by spending on their campaigns. Public Citizen reported that in the 2022 election year, military contractors spent $10.2 million on campaign contributions only to senators and representatives who are members or who were members of the House and Senate Armed Services Committee. They spent this money before the upcoming vote on the 2023 Pentagon benefit. And as you can see, Senator Gary Peters' campaign, and remind you, this is 2022, Slotkin was still a congressional rep, received over $380,000 from contractors. And you know what? There was no military budget he never voted no on. So when a few corporations have more influence on governance than the people, democracy is in trouble. And I have to make a quick note here. Money, yeah, I just remembered something. All right. So the next thing I want to talk about is what is driving increased military spending. There are a lot of factors driving it. In February of this year, the Pentagon proposed cutting its budget by 8% every year, or about $50 billion per year for the next 5 years. And maybe this is just theater, but you know what? Why doesn't Congress take them up on it? Instead, Congress just added $150 billion to the bill. So even without Congress's largesse, the budget still keeps ballooning. And one reason is allocation for contracts. We now have 5 major defense contractors. They are Lockheed Martin, RTX, which is formerly Raytheon, General Dynamics, Boeing, and Northrop Grumman. Now, there are tons of smaller contractors too, and there are new ones because they're getting the business of AI. Microsoft is a military contractor. So all these contractors take up 50% of the budget, of the military budget. And because of this, government pays high prices, and there's just no competition. And so we get price gouging. And I don't know if, I hope that some of you heard a recent NPR podcast interview of Lindsay Kashgarian. She's the program director of the National Priorities Project. And she told a story about the Pentagon and NASA purchasing the same part from the same contractor, but the Pentagon pays hundreds of times more for this part than NASA does, simply because they can get away with it. Another issue is lack of accountability. According to that same commentator, Kashkarian, the Department of Defense is the largest federal agency and has the least accountability. The Pentagon hasn't passed a budget for the last 7 straight years. And she made a really interesting point, which is, audits really only describe how the money is spent. They don't determine whether an expense is justified. And frankly, that's a conversation that Congress and the public should be having. Now, another little known aspect that's driving up military spending has to do with repairing equipment. The military doesn't repair their own equipment, and this task is done by the defense contractors. This is because they claim their technology is proprietary. In other words, the Department of Defense is not allowed to have access to the contractor's technology. And I equate this with the problems that farmers face. Years ago, they were able to fix their own equipment, and that was part of being a farmer. But when tractors and other equipment became high-tech with computers and sensors, companies like John Deere refused to give farmers the software tools needed to fix their equipment. And farmers are forced to go to Deere dealerships that cost them a lot more money. And you may have heard of the right to repair movement. Maybe the DoD should join this movement. Well, then another thing driving costs, of course, is the real waste, fraud, and abuse, not the phony stuff that the press talks about, but the real stuff. So according to the Hill magazine, the US military is actually a lot smaller than they were 50 years ago. So why is it costing more? For example, the Army is about 40% of the size it was in 1975, which makes sense because we were in a war with Vietnam. Then the Navy back then had 559 ships. Right now it has 293. And our Air Force back then had 10,000 aircraft, and we have a little more than half that. And yet military spending has grown. And the Hill magazine or publication points out that a lot of this equipment doesn't even work. And I'm quoting here, what the military does receive is delivered years late and typically twice the quoted price. And many weapon systems also don't work well. For example, the F-35 plane works less than 1/3 of the time. And the Navy has been forced to retire literal combat ships decades ahead of schedule because they can't perform the missions that the Navy wants. And Army leaders canceled the future combat system without producing a single operation vehicle. Talk about fraud, waste, and abuse. That's it. Another thing that's driving military spending is AI. AI is becoming part of autonomous systems like drones. And so the spending has exponentially increased. Now, AI, it presents another problem. Kashgarian made a really interesting point in her interview that there is an issue of accountability. Let's say a soldier accidentally shoots a civilian when he's aiming at a general. We can hold him accountable. We can't hold a drone, or another weapon, an unmanned ship that's been driven by AI. So this brings up just a big thorny question that really we as a society need to talk about. I think another thing that's driving the costs is simply cowardice on the part of our politicians. They are afraid to look like they don't want to defend our country. They just don't want to be soft, seen as soft. So they vote for bigger and bigger budgets. And the few people who don't are just incredibly brave. And it's sad that we have to call people like Rashida Tlaib and the others, brave just for voting no on a budget. And then, of course, there's the obvious reason that our budgets go up. The National Priorities Project did a report 10 years ago on the 20-year war on terror, and they said it cost us $21 trillion for those 20 years. And then, of course, we've got the Gaza going on and the genocide going on in Gaza. The money we're spending on weapons for Israel's war is in the billions. The Watson Institute for International Public Affairs reported that from October 7, 2023 to September 30th, 2024, we spent $22.7 billion. And this is on top of our annual commitment of $3.8 billion per year, which we've committed through 2028. So the last item I want to talk about in relation to aspects driving the costs is just, beyond the usual greed and corruption, there are the geopolitical reasons for increases in military spending. First, the United States and the Pentagon has always just simply wanted to have complete military domination of the world. That's why we have over 700 bases. And we have to ask ourselves as a society, do we really need to dominate the world? Then we have, in recent years, our support for Ukraine, our decades-long support for NATO, and now the new Cold War on China. Trump is backing away from the former. He's backing away from Ukraine and NATO, but he's all in on the war against China. That big, beautiful bill, which I'll talk about next, includes over $500 million for Air Force exercises in the Pacific Ocean. And a libertarian think tank calls this expense a rather expensive way to saber rattle with China. I quite agree. This is not because China poses a military threat, though they are growing their military, but it's because of its growing economy. I don't have the time to talk about that, but that's a whole nother ball of wax. So let's talk about that one big, beautiful bill. Do you know, when I first heard about it, I thought that was just a joke. People were just calling it that, but then I looked it up. Sure enough, as you can see from this official document, it is called the one big, beautiful bill. And it passed on May 22nd in the House by one vote, the importance of elections, 215 votes to 214. And now it's in reconciliation. The House added $150 billion to the Pentagon, to their budget in this bill. The Senate Arms Service Committee added $156 billion. We don't know what the final number might be, although they may have reconciled it by now. But it's roughly in that area. So military spending usually goes through an appropriations process, but instead it's going through reconciliation. Congress prefers to submit bills using the reconciliation process because only a simple majority is needed to pass it, instead of the 60 votes required for appropriations bills, making them subject to filibuster. In other words, it allows the party in power to make spending decisions without support from the other party. Doesn't sound very democratic to me. Also, the Senate has a lot of leeway determining what's in the bill. The Senate parliamentarian actually issues rulings on what is allowed to be included in the bill. So both the Democrats and Republicans use reconciliation to push their agendas through. The Republican majority is thin, so they're trying to pass a catch-all bill now, maybe out of worry about the 2026 elections. So they might see this as their last chance. Another difference between the appropriations and reconciliation processes is that major policy decisions aren't allowed in the reconciliation process, only appropriation. There's something called the Byrd Rule, introduced by Senator Robert Byrd in 1985, which states that any policy changes must only be incidental. But policy changes have been introduced in this bill, including authorizing the military to do immigration enforcement. This is an alarming development because it violates the Posse Comitatus Act, which was passed in 1878, which bars the federal military from enforcing domestic law. So what exactly is in this bill? Well, one thing we know is the Golden Dome. This is Trump's version of protecting us from missile defense. And the House has appropriated $25 billion for this system. And it's intended to protect us from long-range intercontinental ballistic missiles. The name Golden Dome is similar to the name of Israel's Iron Dome, but the comparison stops there. And the reason for this is simple. Scientists say the Golden Dome won't work. And the headline of an article in the Science News website says it all. Quote, Trump's Golden Dome plan has a major obstacle, physics. So Israel's system actually blocks only short and medium range missiles, which are slow, but the Golden Dome is supposed to intercept ICBMs, which fly much faster. And this means the system would need space-based technology. According to Jeffrey Lewis, a professor at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies, The Golden Dome would need 16,000 interceptors in space to knock out 10 long-range missiles. So scientists are very skeptical about this program, and I do tend to, listen to scientists. And the 25 billion appropriation would only be the beginning of the spending. So apparently, we haven't learned a darn thing about the failed Star Wars program under Reagan. Another expenditure is $14 billion to modernize our nuclear capability, and especially so-called Sentinel ICBMs. So our nuclear capability is described as a triad. We can launch missiles from land, air, and water. And the Sentinel land-based systems are more vulnerable, and experts say we should phase them out. That's what the Sentinel ICBM system is supposed to do, replace those land-based systems in the next 10 years. But part of this $14 billion is going to land-based systems. So even if we support having nuclear weapons, which we don't, throwing money at old technology is a waste. Another big expenditure is for shipbuilding. The $34 billion allocated for this is the largest portion of the Pentagon part of the bill. And the Pentagon wants to build 16 new battleships, a nuclear submarine, unmanned ships, and other kinds of vessels. There are two reasons for expanding our shipbuilding capability that I'll mention here. There are probably more. One is to prepare for a confrontation with China instead of using diplomacy. And also, Congress sees this as a big jobs program, and shipbuilding does bring in jobs. So as far as China goes, China currently has more warp ships than the US, 234 to our 219, but the US has more guided missile cruisers and destroyers. If we build more ships, China will continue to build more and will be another arms race of a different kind. And as pointed out by Lindsay Koshgarian of that project, the Priorities Project, in her NPR interview, instead of engaging in diplomacy with China and working together on issues like climate change, the US has actually started a new Cold War. This was ramped up under Biden. And Koshgarian said that if we want to prevent a war, we should engage in diplomacy. Instead, the White House in April proposed a 50% cut to the State Department budget, and this budget bill proposes an 80% cut. So this tells you where our administration's priorities are. By the way, I just could not resist including this image, even though it's not directly related to any of my points. The second largest military expansion in this bill would go to building up our manufacturing of weapons. There's a research analyst at the Stimson Center. Her name is Julia Gledhill. She brings up an interesting point about this part of the bill. She said, and I quote, "There's no guarantee that investing in production capacity will actually increase production capacity because military contractors historically spend their money on shareholders and executive compensation." What she's really talking about is how our whole capitalist system has changed in the last 20 years. We're seeing this across a lot of sectors. Instead of investing profits in infrastructure, companies buy up their own stock, they drive up the price of the stock, and they use profits to give bigger rewards to their CEOs and their shareholders. This is called financialization. In this modern era, manufacturing is not the name of the game. Making money off money is. Another expense in the bill is $13 billion allocated to developing new weapons, such as the B-21 strategic bomber, the Sentinel ballistic missiles, underwater drones, and the F-47 plane. Now, there is speculation that F-47 is named after the 47th presidency of he who must not be named. It should be pointed out, though, that this $13 billion is for development only, and it will not cover production costs. I also want to mention the deployment of armed forces for civilian purposes. One of those purposes is the use of troops for immigration enforcement. $5 billion will be given to the DoD to support the military's border operations. They're going to use soldiers, or have been to a little extent, to capture and detain migrants and deport them. So they got to give the Pentagon money for this. So $150 billion is a lot to add to any agency, especially to one that's already bloated. And in the meantime, the proposed bill also makes drastic cuts to programs for human needs. It slashed $300 billion from SNAP, which we know as food stamps, $800 billion from Medicaid for starters. Well, that extra money for the Pentagon and money for tax breaks for the rich has got to come from somewhere. So they figure cut human needs. So let's talk about money for human needs instead of the Pentagon. What would it look like if we had economic conversion? I'm going to show you an interesting graph from the Cost of War project with Brown University. And what this shows is that for every $1 million spent on defense, 5.8 jobs is created directly in defense industries. So that's the green colored bars. And then 1.1 jobs in the supply chain, that's the gray bar, for a total of 6.9 jobs, the blue bar. So let's focus on those blue bars for a second and compare other areas. So for every $1 million of spending in wind or solar energy, for example, wind creates a total of 8.4 jobs. That's compared to 6.9 jobs in the military. Solar creates 9.5 jobs. In education, healthcare, job creation is even higher. Healthcare spending creates more than twice as many jobs for the same level of spending, while education creates up to nearly 3 times as many jobs as defense spending. And this is especially true in elementary and secondary education. In an interview with NPR, Larry Wilkerson, he's a retired Army Chief of Staff who used to work for Colin Powell. He told an interesting story about economic conversion. He actually was working for Colin Powell, who directed him to make cuts in the military budget. One of the things Wilkerson did was eliminate a Navy pier in Newport, Rhode Island. Someone who worked at the pier was very angry about this, and he told Wilkerson that Newport would go to hell if the whole pier was shut down. Well, 7 years later, Wilkerson said he actually checked in, even though they was out of power, he checked in with the same person. And the same person told him that the decision to cut the pier was the best decision Wilkerson ever made. The space that was occupied by the pier generated $4 billion worth of civilian commerce, while the military generated only $200 million worth. And as a side note, they also got rid of a bunch of drunken sailors who apparently were causing problems in bars. So, if we are to have a big, beautiful society, one that values life over death, we need to cut military spending and stop fueling wars. So the last part of my talk is briefly just what can we do to push this agenda? Well, the immediate need is to prevent the United States from going to war with Iran. It's time to bring back the slogan, "I'm already against the next war." Some of us remember Eugene Barron's button with that slogan. Some protests have begun and they will grow. And it's interesting, Trump's supporters are deeply divided about this, and the president is hesitating, giving himself 2 weeks to decide whether to join forces with Israel. We need to take advantage of this divide. Unfortunately, many of Michigan's politicians, like Congresswoman Haley Stevens, support Israel's attacks on Iran. We need to pressure our reps. We need to call them, visit their hours, organize or join protests. Second, we need to talk about getting money out of politics. And Citizens United is part of and I'm ad-libbing here. I have to talk with a script, unfortunately, but I have to ad-lib here because this came to me in the middle. Money in politics is just a terribly corrupting force. And we don't have any bills at the moment where we can push that, but hopefully after we get rid of this regime, we can start on that path. On a side note, in Michigan, there actually is a bill to not allow big corporations to donate to campaigns in Michigan. And that's called Taking Back Our Power. That relates to the power that DTE and Consumer Energies have because they bribe politicians. So that's one place where you can get money out of politics. So look for those petitions coming out soon. Anyway, the next thing we need to talk about is move the money. Peace Action and other groups have supported the campaign to move money from Pentagon spending to funding human needs. In the past few years, members of Congress have proposed bills to reduce the Pentagon budget by 10%. But at the moment, we only have one piece of legislation that I know of to reduce spending, and that is Eleanor Holmes Norton's bill. Eleanor Holmes Norton is a non-voting representative from Congress representing DC. That city should be a state. Talk about lack of democracy. Her bill is called Nuclear Weapons Abolition Act and Conversion Act of 2025. She introduced in March this year. I'm proud to say that Wilf US was instrumental in getting this bill introduced. We worked with her and worked on getting signatures and getting congressmen to support it. This bill would abolish nukes and convert money to human needs. It would address the climate crisis. It would address housing, healthcare, and restoring the environment. The 2026 election might flip Congress, making 2027 the next opportunity to pass good legislation like this. We also need to elect pro-peace candidates. And this is really very difficult. This is something where you need to lay the groundwork for it. You can't just work on someone's campaign that year and hope and pray they get elected. This requires building the peace movement and a peace constituency, and it takes years. We need a peace constituency that sees war as unthinkable, a peace constituency that loves and values peace, that understands that we have to move the money. And this means educating the public in all sorts of ways. Lastly, we have to be part of the anti-Trump resistance. This is growing and it will impact next year's elections, although some people are wondering if we will have them. We shall see. And this is a great opportunity to grow the peace movement, to educate people about Pentagon spending and about the Move the Money campaigns. I went to the Detroit June 15th No Kings rally, and it was really exciting. There were over 5,000 people in Clark Park. I saw a lot of young people. There have been some complaints about how previous demos, like the one on April 5th, a lot were more middle-aged people and older, but this time there were tons of young people in Detroit. Now imagine if peace activists had circulated petitions demanding move the money. Imagine if we recruited some of those people to call and visit our elected officials and to hold house meetings to educate others about military spending. You know, these anti-Trump protests need to be for something, not just against Trump. In my mind, that's a flaw in the current messaging out there. It's all about Trump. It's really a lot more about Trump. And we need to move beyond just him and talk about what we are for. A Move the Money campaign could articulate the positives that people are desperately yearning for. Good paying jobs, high quality and free education, low cost housing, a clean planet, and more. These protests are organized by 5051, Indivisible, and other groups and coalitions are not going away. The next one will be July 17 under the theme of Making Good Trouble in memory of Congressman John L. Lewis. So let's show up with pro-peace banners, petitions, and flyers. Let's build a movement. Thank you for your time.
Well, thank you so much, Laura. There was a lot there for us to think about, and I've been trying to take notes as quickly as I can, but we do have this whole program recorded. But this is the time to ask questions or offer comments, and I know that you all have something you would like to say, but let's try to keep this down to questions rather than giving little small lectures, because we only have maybe about 20 minutes of time here. But we thank again Laura for the hard work she's doing on this topic. Who would like to be first here?
I'll go first. This is Judith Sheldon. And first of all, Laura, thank you for gathering a comprehensive, simplified, it's all together. You made it sensible. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Hi, Laura. This is Kathleen McNellis, and I would like to know, I absolutely agree with Judith that you did an amazing job here. It's well sourced. Your talk was balanced. It was easy to understand for everyone. There wasn't a lot of different kind of lingo and stuff that was thrown in there. But I know that you are part of a peace organization, Peace and Freedom, actually. And I wanted to know, we really, here at the Gray Panthers, we focus specifically on actionable items. And you did speak a little bit to contacting Congress people, contacting senators, getting out there and doing some resistance work if we can. What does your organization do, and how are you attacking this?
Yeah, well, on a national level, we have a very substantial committee, two committees, one on Middle East, and that's advocating for peace in the Middle East, and another one on anti-nuclear weapons. The Nuclear Weapons Committee is pretty active, and it's really pushing hard for Eleanor Holmes Norton's bill. We also have environmental committee that's been pushing for getting rid of PFAS in the environment, which relates to the military. So, and I have to say the peace movement overall has been weak, and I will say that WILF is part of that weakness. We are not as robust as we need to be. So we need to, I think the peace movement was big during the Iraq War, and we have not been galvanized to that extent since. And I'm faulting ourselves. And in the times, sometimes people take things for granted when there's a lull in wars, and we don't react quickly when the wars ramp up. Another issue is that young people have not been joining peace groups like they have in the past. And we need to recruit young people.
Yeah.
So that to me, and unfortunately, I'm not telling you exactly what we're doing now, but what we need to do, which is to recruit members. And I think that we've gotten away, I have to say, a lot of organizations, including like churches, are losing members. This is not confined to the peace movement. And then sometimes you'll have spontaneous groups popping up. And I'll never forget when the Iraq War started, Al Fishman was complaining that all these sorts of new groups just popped up, including Collins Mills Citizens for Peace. And what he was saying, though, is that why don't people join the existing groups instead of splintering off? However, Citizens for Peace has staying power. So I'm so glad that Citizens for Peace was formed. And whereas some of these other groups that formed dropped away. So we're not seeing young people jump into the peace groups. They are jumping into other kinds of activism, though. I'm not discounting the participation of young people at all. Peace is just not on their radar. It's a more abstract concept for them.
Okay.
I'd like to make a comment if I can. I'm one of Laura's sisters, April. Laura, you did a great job. Speaking of Al Fishman, I just wanted to relate, years ago, they were working on the conversion, and I think there was something going on at maybe it was the Warren Tank Plant or one of these military, and they were in the prospect, looming was, oh, are they going to shut us down? And he was having discussions with the leadership there. And he says, yeah, they were almost buying into this conversion thing, converting to making buses instead of tanks or whatever. He said, and they were really close to endorsing this. But then the lid lifted on them being shut down. And he says, and there went their interest. That was it. So somehow tying into people's self-interest, linking that more, I think exposing the corruption, through the military or any of these other things. Those are things that resonate, all the corruption that's going on, not just waste, but corruption. That's a couple things. The other thing is when you talk about the percentage of GDP, I heard one podcast and it says, United States has 5% of the world population and 25% of the world GDP. So you take, 0.25% of ours, and it's, 12 times more than, like Greece is saying 2% of theirs. That's a limit. As we know, percentages, sales tax, those are regressive. So, you can't really compare percentages across the board. So just wanted to put that in there. Thanks.
That's a really great point. If I can just interject there. Yeah, that's an excellent point, and leave it to a math person to bring that up. Thanks, April.
Hey, I see Colleen's hand up.
Thanks so much, Laura. That was great. And thank you for bringing up the Citizens for Peace. We're still hanging in there. And we live in Livonia, a bunch of us, but we have members all over. And I think the reason we're still hanging in there is we educate every month we have something that's educational. And we had in Livonia, like over 2,000 people at that rally. And I had a giant peace sign and I had the SOS sign, save our schools, because I'm so upset with what's happening with our education. I was a Detroit teacher for 35 years, and the way they're cutting our education all the way up to Harvard, it's very upsetting. But my granddaughter and her mom drove by and they stopped, and she was so excited to see me demonstrating. But talking about our programs, we have Kevin Zawala, who is Mr. Peace, a young guy who has devoted his life to trying to motivate children in a very positive way. And he goes all over the country. So he's our speaker July 8th. And it's for adults, positivity, be our best selves. He needs to talk to us too, and he's reaching out to youth. So what I'm saying is, if you have positive messages, it draws in the young people. He's so successful in, like, all over all the country, all the states. And then we have peace advocacy in the shadow of war, Fran Shore, and then we have Dr. Saeed Khan. And years ago, he presented something to our group, and I said, it'd be great if you could talk to us again. He says, yeah, I'll talk to you anytime. I said, how about September? He's never missed a September meeting. And he's so inspirational. I'm sorry.
I want to make space for some other questions or
I'm
comments.
sorry. I'm excited about youth and everything. So
we honor
thank you,
what
Laura.
you're saying, that's for sure. I see Jan Van Door's hand up. And Jan is a national leader with the Gray Panthers. And let's see, you need to unmute yourself.
Thank you, Randy. I really appreciate all the work that Laura has done, and I especially respect the intense research done by the national leaders in WILF. And we're very fortunate in our local Gray Panthers Washtenaw group to have Al Haber and his wife, who have been longtime peace activists. And Al has a very good workshop that he presents on the war system. Until we understand fully how integrated the war system is, it's very hard to get your hands around it and figure out what you can do to have an impact. And my question for you, if you have had a chance to pick up on this problem, is the various peace groups just aren't very well knit together. We don't have a peace system, and we need such a thing. We've got scattered groups all over. I've been part of the anti-nuclear movement for a long time. One of its leaders in Michigan is right there in Livonia. And yeah. We are not connected well enough for the larger peace effort. I'm seeing this over and over again. I think that's got to be fixed somehow, because we're not all working on the same part of the war system, and we'd be a lot more effective if we were.
Thank you, Jan. I see another hand up here. I see a couple.
Can I address that? Can I address that, her question? Yeah. So there is a local coalition of peace groups. However, we are only meeting online and just chatting with a handful of us. And that is Detroit Area Peace with Justice Network. We would like to have every peace group come to those meetings. And it used to be, we formed that coalition in the wake of the Iraq War. And so, but we are still meeting, unfortunately, just a handful of us meet just to touch base. Chuck Altman is part of that. And if any group wants to be a part of that, those conversations, and start coordinating efforts, contact me or Chuck Altman. We'll let you know when the next meeting is. Nationally, there used to be United for Peace and Justice Coalition, and that did fall apart. I don't think that's in existence anymore. So we do need a national one. And I've actually, WILF US has a new executive director, and I've been urging the board and our president to actually, now that to start reaching out to the other national groups and start talking about what can we do nationally in concert with each other.
Mhm.
Well, we've got another person who goes by the moniker of Dance the Keys. So share with us what your question or your comment might be.
I think someone else was first.
Well, I didn't see it that way, but
Dave, first?
I think it's my turn.
all right, Dave.
I was very disappointed that Reverend Peacock couldn't be here. But Laura, you did a wonderful, wonderful job, and thank you for filling in. It was great. You obviously did lots of research, but you educated me to something that I'm a retired, not retired. I served in the United States Navy on submarines, and I saw a tremendous change. I got out in '64, but the change in the military in the last 20 years, because of corporatization and profit, the amount of servicemen we have are dramatically reduced. But it was a decent place for someone from a little education to have a future. But that's been taken away because of profit for the rich guys. And it's something that we don't talk about enough. When I was in, I decided not to stay because frankly, I had a future, I hoped, and it turned out pretty good. But the reality was that when I was in, if a guy, in that time it was all guys. If a guy decided to stay in a submarine force for 20 years, he could plan on spending half of his time with his family, raising a family, and having a home port in Connecticut or San Diego or our place, and he could raise a family. Within a couple of years after I got out, it changed dramatically. If you joined the military, you were going to be at sea 8, 9, maybe 10 months out of the year, and it became not the place for someone that wanted to have a family. It became the place for people who want to save money to buy a new car so they could crash it. I mean, it isn't nice to talk about, but the reality was the military-industrial complex that David Eisenhower reminded us about and warned us about has not been adhered. It used to be, and I don't mean this in any small way, it used to be that the military would be the Army or the Navy more than anybody else. We created our own repairs. We did it, whether it be a ship or we repaired them. So there was work for us to be done in port, which meant you could have a family and maybe even have a kid, But what happened was the military-industrial complex took over everything, and they reduced the opportunities for young people to have a career in the military. I know most of the people here don't agree, but I believe the military is not a bad career if someone has a chance to have a family, because we need people like me. I'm a peacenik for a long time. I've made lots of donations to you, but I mean your organizations. But the reality is that they've destroyed it by making more money for themselves. The CEOs make more and more money, and they don't pay their employees, whether it be Macomb County. You look at the median wage in Macomb County, it's not that great, and yet they're the biggest employer here for military spending. Our problem is corporations getting richer, and it isn't the military. And I will advocate strongly that we do need a peacetime military. We just don't need it to be how do I say it? Slaves is what it's become.
Okay. Well, thank you for sharing that, Dave. Dave is one of those people that I really turn to for a lot of advice, and I appreciate that. We have 5 more minutes left for this meeting, and we're kind of right now looking for actions that we can take. And I see, again, Dance the Keys is the person who's had her hand up for a bit. What would you like to share?
I wanted to say that young people are involved in peace. They don't name it peace. They call it March for Your Lives. They call it Green Peace. They call it Earth Justice. And we need to reach out. Our leadership needs to reach out to their leadership to say, hey, thank you for serving in that specific area of peace. Can we work together? How can we support you? We'd love your support. We need to make that connection, which I think Laura was talking about earlier. Young people are engaged.
Okay, thank you for sharing that. We were at the No Kings March. That's where I met you here on a week ago on Saturday, and our board is going to be talking about that. In either case, we do have a special concern about with Gray Panthers being intergenerational that we want to reach out to and involve young people. And we're going to be talking about it at our board meeting, but there was just as you say, a lot of young people were there that were concerned about what's going on in terms of our country. So we have that challenge ahead of us. I guess I'd like to invite Danny Foster if I could. And Laura, maybe you want to say something first, but Danny's been on the front line for reaching out to young people through Eastern Michigan University. So, but Laura, if you want to say a few, what we're looking for is what you would recommend as actions, and I'd like to also hear from Danny.
Okay, I really just, I think the actions, I already mentioned a few in the end of my talk, but I really just wanted to talk about young people for a second. This morning I walked to my Kroger, and after getting over the astonishing fact that there was a clerk and two baggers at 8:30 in the morning, because usually you have to check yourself out, there were these two young people, baggers, high school age, debating the Gaza war. I looked at them, I'm like, you're the kind of people I want voting. I said, you know stuff. And it was just kind of ironic that it happened on this day. And I walked home with a smile on my face. So there is hope. Judith, I do agree with you. There is hope with young people. Thanks. That's it.
Good.
Okay. Did we have, Danny, would you like to share anything? You've been a strong advocate for protecting education and making sure that the schools and students don't get cuts, and also concerned about DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion as being a perverse kind of thing that's been opposed by the Trump administration.
Yeah, like a few other people said, young people are definitely involved, just kind of in different ways, and it might just look a little bit different than you're used to seeing. And I think a lot of the reason that young people might be a little bit less engaged, even including myself sometimes, is time in life. Working numerous jobs myself to try to get ends to meet. It's hard to even find time for myself, let alone, unfortunately, being able to attend protests and advocacy and things outside of that. So a lot of times what we do is we will do more social media advocacy and like sharing information and pushing what we know to other people. And that's one way that we're able to engage, as well as through like our school, like student organizations, for example, on college campuses or even in high schools, they also have after school programs. So we're definitely here. We definitely hear everybody and we are involved. And I think it just looks a little bit different than what it used to.
Okay. Any further questions or comments? I know every one of you has a lot to say. Paul, did you want to share something that Paul or Chuck, you've been with Gray Panthers for a long time?
No, just great presentation.
Very good.
Okay. Well, if there's no further comments at this time, I'll just say that our Gray Panthers Board of Directors will be meeting here right after this meeting. And so there's several of us that are on this call right now, and we'll be talking about this discussion and identifying ways that we can take action. So we're not just having another talk that we had this morning, but we're taking action. So that'll be part of our agenda for the board. And if you wanted to sit in, you don't get to vote, but you could join us for the board meeting that follows immediately after this presentation. So at this point, I'm going to say, let's all give Laura a special, I guess you could say, a special word of appreciation. You can use your computer to do that, or however you want to say thank you, Laura, for doing a great presentation.
Well, thank you too, Randy. I really appreciate it because I learned something along the way too. Thanks.
Thank you.
Have a good day, everybody.
Okay.
Peace out.